Last week we started talking about your story. And stories begin with your name. My name's Chad. And when I was born a long, long time ago, Chad was a pretty unusual name. You didn't hear it very often. And I remember growing up and being asked, well, what's your name? I said, Chad. I said, oh, really? Okay, I've heard of that, but you're the first Chad I ever met. Well, where did that name come from? Well, I found out that my dad had a friend, and his name was Chad. In fact, his name was Chadwick. He was from some British descent, and Chadwick is some kind of British-oriented name. And so his name was Chadwick, but he hated the name Chadwick. So when he introduced himself and told people what his name was, he would say, well, my name's Chadwick, but it's just Chad. It's just Chad. Well, when I came along, I don't think it was Mom's idea, but it was Dad's idea because of the relationship that he had with his friend Chad to call me Chad. I remember at times where Dad would introduce me to someone when I was just a little guy. And he says, this is my son, Chad. And they said, that's kind of an unusual name. Yeah, it's Chad. Just Chad. I remember him saying that. Just Chad. Just Chad. And as I got older and I began to kind of understand that, there was something the way he said just Chad. It helped me understand that my name was connected to a relationship that he had. And it was connected to history too. And I imagine every time my dad said just Chad, he wasn't just saying just Chad for me because I wasn't named Chadwick, right? When he would say his name's Chad, just Chad, it was really a connection to him and his friend. And for him to sticking up to what his friend wanted to be called. Our names, they're connected to history, aren't they? They have a history behind them. Well, I know a lot of you have histories to your names. Maybe you're named after an aunt or an uncle or grandma or great-grand, towns. Rupert? That has to be a relative, right? Rupert? Towns Rupert? Yeah. How many of you are named after a relative? Probably a lot. A lot of you are. Yeah. Or maybe you're named after someone who's famous. A great ball player, great football player. Or perhaps an imaginary character in a Walt Disney movie, right? Riley. Yeah. How many of those names maybe have come from famous places? I don't know if you've heard this before, but when our twins came along, Darla and I almost exhausted all the names that we were thinking of for kids. In fact, we were surprised when she got pregnant and when they did an ultrasound and I remember the day she walked in and she gave me a little picture and it said twin A and twin B. And I had no words. No words. And we were thinking about, what are we going to name them? Well, I thought hard, and I came up with two that I kind of liked. I was all set to name them Dallas and Odessa. I mean, it has a ring, right? Dallas D and Odessa D, right? It just rolls off your tongue. Isn't it beautiful? And they were both places. I grew up in the Dallas area. Darla had grown up in the Odessa area. I thought it was perfect. Dallas and Odessa. I can still say, Dallas, come over here. Odessa, where are you? That's cool. But my wife wouldn't have any of it. Thanks. Thanks, Mom. And this is probably the first you ever heard this story, right? And maybe you wish now you could unhear it, right? Yeah, that's right. But our names are connected to history. Sometimes to a friend that was real special to our parents, or a place, or some kind of connection. And that name is special to you. Did you know that it's special to God? Did you know that God knows every one of your names? The Bible says He knows you by your name. That means that He knows you intimately. He knows you personally. He knows that part of you that is just who you are. But I'm just wondering, how many of you know God that way? Do you know Him? Do you know His name? Do you know His name? You know, for thousands and thousands of years, people just called a deity God. Or some civilizations would call them Father, or they would call them Creator, or just All-Powerful One. And for many, many years, it was just that generic name, just God. Not a personal name, not an intimate name, just God. And when God came and He wanted to set the children of Israel free from their slavery in Egypt, God appeared to Moses in a burning bush, and He said, I want you to go to Pharaoh and tell him to let my people go. And Moses, trying to find a way out of it, he says, like nobody's going to listen to me. They're going to ask me who it is that told me to come cause all of this trouble. And God says, in Exodus chapter 3:15, He says, you tell the Israelites that the Lord. And that Lord, and that name Lord in Hebrew was Yahweh. And nobody had ever heard that name before. Never heard the name of Yahweh. It wasn't all the traditional, generic, ordinary names that people had for God. This was totally different, because you know what? God was giving him His intimate name, the name by which He wants us to know Him and relate to Him. It tells us everything about it, because Yahweh is translated literally, I am that I am. And if that sounds like a weird name to you, this is how God wanted it to impact on each and every one of their hearts. And that is that when people came to Him and had a need and said, God, I need your help. God, I need your strength. God, I need you to intervene. God wanted them to know that He was that. He is. And that's what that name means. No matter what your need is, no matter what provision you're looking for from God, no matter what is going on in your life that is important to you, God says, I am that. I am. And it was that affirmation that He was everything, all out, all for them. And that was His name. That was who He was. And it's not just that personal name that He wanted His people to know Him by, that He was there for them no matter what. It was also that He was also a God who had a history with them. There was a story behind it. And the Bible goes on to say, I am the God of your forefathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. This is my name forever, the name you shall call me from generations to generations. This is how I want you to know me. I am the God that's going to be everything you need. And I am the God of your forefathers. I am the God of your history. I am the God of your ancestors. That's God. That's God. And what He was saying is that He was the God that came to Abraham. You remember the story of Abraham? God called him and said, I want you to leave your home where you are, and I want you to follow me, and you're going to become a great nation. And I'll bless you, and I'll look after you, and I'm taking you to a promised land. When Abraham was 75 years old, God came to him, and you know no other God had ever spoken to anybody in any culture before that time? gods didn't speak. Can you imagine that moment when Abraham, who only knew other gods, heard a God speaking to him, and that God knew his name, and that God cared about him, and that God was going to protect him and be with him, and that he had a purpose for his life and a destiny for his people, and that he was going to become a great nation? And for 25 years, all Abraham did was to follow the lead of God. That's all he did. And for 25 years, God was faithful in looking after him, providing for him, helping them grow as a family. He protected them. He blessed them. And all Abraham did for 25 years, he just went. He just went. When Abraham was 100 years old, God came and gave him the promise that he was waiting for, and that is that son Isaac. The son through whom his descendants were going to be just like the dust of the ground, just like the stars in the sky. And Abraham and Isaac believed that covenant and that promise, what God would do, because he was going to make it happen. And when Abraham was 137 years old, God asked him to do the unthinkable. He said, I want you to take your son, your one and only son that you love, and I want you to sacrifice him to me. And Abraham went on a mountain and bound up his son, Isaac, 37 years old, grown, strapping man, put him down and pulled out a knife and was about to sacrifice him because God asked him to. And God intervened and stopped him. And then God provided a sacrifice. And he gave Abraham his son back. And can you imagine the history that just unfolded in that moment? Where Isaac, who was going to allow his dad to take his life, and Abraham who was going to be faithful to God and do what God was asking him. And the Bible says that Abraham was going to do that, and Isaac was letting him, because they both believed that God would take care of him, and he had the power to raise him from the dead, even if he was sacrificed. Can you imagine that kind of faith? Can you imagine that history in that moment when Abraham was 137 years old? When he was 160 years old, Isaac had two sons, his grandsons, Jacob and Esau. And Abraham lived 15 more years after that, dying at the age of 175. But for 15 years, he knew those two boys, his grandsons. 3 generations bonded together by this journey that they were on, by these promises that were given, by the behaviors of father and grandfather who were faithful to God and follow God. Just imagine the stories that they would tell in their families across those 3 generations. Just think about that. Can you imagine Abraham saying, I remember the first night God spoke to me. He said, leave my home. We just packed everything and we just left. Sarah was saying to me, like, where are we going, Abraham? Where's this God taking us? I said, I don't know. Got no clue. I'm just following him. Where are we going? To where he wants to take us. Can you imagine them talking about, but gee, Dad, didn't that sound crazy? I mean, gee, Dad, how did you do that? Well, God never talked to me before. I never experienced that a God knew my name, talked to me. And I followed him, and he was faithful. He did everything he said he was going to do, so I believed everything he said that he would do. Can you imagine the stories? You imagine the stories that Isaac would have told? Man, we just traveled. My whole life we went just from place to place, living in tents, taking care of our herds, just being this sort of tribal family all together. And then that day God took me up on the mountain. And I could see what he was doing. He was tying me up. Should I fight him? Should I have just bumped old Dad out of the way, run down the hill, jumped a camel and rode back to Mom's tent and told her, he's crazy, he's nuts, we got to get out of here? But he didn't do that. Because he, by following his dad and watching the life he lived in his faithfulness and seeing how God always provided, he began to believe that if God said that God had the power to keep the promises he made on the future. And the promise for Isaac was that he was going to have children who would then give birth to an entire nation of people. And can you imagine Jacob? Jacob blew up his family. We got problems where our kids fight in our family, don't talk to each other, go their separate ways. We got those problems that go on, right? Jacob dropped an atomic bomb on his family. He stole the birthright, basically, took advantage of his brother, got the birthright that belonged to his brother, and he got it, and he had to leave home because he was afraid his brother would kill him. And he went off to this far-off place all by himself, and guess what? God took care of him. God looked after him. God blessed him. And he had a family. And there in that faraway place, he had 12 sons. And he came home, and he made peace with his brother. And he came home and bonded with his family. He overcame those issues and those struggles that he created years ago when he was so young and impetuous. And his 12 sons became the 12 tribes of Israel, the nation of God's people. Your stories have family. Your families have stories. And your stories are about your families, aren't they? Your story is connected to your history. And one of the things as we think about our story, God tells us that our story is about our history and it's about generations, not just individuals. But it's about generations. It's about the spiritual walk in the lives that our fathers and mothers and our grandfathers and our grandmothers live. It's about their lives. It's about how their stories and their lives and their personality and how their histories, they connect. And that those connections, and God uses all those influences, good or bad, that have brought all of you here, right here today. You need to understand that. That's what God says when He says, I am the God of your father, of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. That means God is the God of your generations. And sometimes we have to think about that. We have to look at that. I don't know how many of you know about Darla's story, but, Darla's story, her faith comes from her great-grandmother. Her grandmother and her parents weren't stellar followers of Jesus Christ, but her great-grandmother was. I mean, she was in church every time the doors were open. She was a lady, even in her 70s, when the church wanted to put in a little bit of library, she went and she figured out and learned the Dewey Decimal System so that she could do that in her church. I mean, she was that kind of servant in the church. She was always at church. She was always talking about Jesus. In fact, that's where Darla learned about Jesus, was from her. She just didn't talk about Jesus. She set example. She lived the life of following Jesus. And one of the greatest days of her life was this just one Sunday when she manipulated it so that all of her grandchildren could come to church on the same day. In a good old Baptist church. And there's a moment in that church where everybody gets to stand up and introduce their guest, right? And she got to stand up with this great pride, and those grandkids all sitting on a pew, and she introduced that. She says, "These are my grands. My grands." And I want to tell you that the history of her life impacted 4 generations. 4 generations. I hear her great grandmother speaking to her as she raised our kids and our grandkids. The same sayings, the same mannerisms. You see how our stories and how God is working and how God is present is with us across those generations. Because it's our stories. It's these kinds of stories that teach us about our faith. They teach us about God. So that when we look back and we say, God made promises and God stuck around and He was there. And He kept those promises to us. And generations understand that. And they see that. So today I just want to ask each and every one of you, look back 3 generations right now in your life, your family. Look back 3 generations. And maybe you've already done this. Maybe you've already did that little inventory, mom's side, dad's side, grandfather, great-grandfather. You've already done all that and said, I sure got a lot of train wrecks in my history. I got a lot of abandonment. I got abuse. I got addiction. I got fragmented families. I've got blended families all coming. Terrible family issues. Maybe our family for the last 3 generations have been cursed, like just cursed. And then all of a sudden you'll think of one spiritual anchor, one person, like Darla's great-grandmother. She was a spiritual anchor of that entire family. An anchor that held generations, 4th generation down, was the anchor of the faith of those kiddos, those grands. And maybe it's just you. Maybe you are that one in the midst of a lot of family issues, a lot of struggle, maybe a lot of tragedy. And I'm telling you, because you are here right now, that is God being faithful. That is who God is. You see, what happens is that God can redeem a family, even with all the train wrecks and the chaos and the craziness. And here today, we're all together and we all know Jesus, right? That's God's faithfulness. In spite of the world and in spite of it all. Now I want you to, you look back. You've looked back 3 generations. Now I want you to sort of look forward 3 generations. Some of you are like Abraham. You've seen your kids grow up. You've seen those grandkids come up. Maybe some of you are on the threshold of seeing some great-grandkids. I want you to look. You old timers like me. I want you to look in the generations, the 2 generations that are ahead of you. And maybe some of you are already thinking, I could have done a lot better. Maybe you're worried about a daughter, son, a grandkid, a couple of grandkids. I want to tell you today what to do, okay? You sit down and write your story. Last week I gave the kids a book. I hope they've been pestering you. And mommy, can you write in my book? Can you write in my... And I wrote something in Colt's book, and I hope all the kids saying, Mommy's got to write something like that for me too. Daddy's got to write... Grandma and Grandpa have to write something like that. Hey, write that story. Do it. Write it. And if not for them, you just write it for yourself. You sit back and you just think about those generations. And you just look where God was and where He showed up and where He jumped out at a moment and a time in someone's life. Look what that perspective you have as a grandparent. As that first generation of the 3 generations. Shame on you if you don't write those stories. Write them. God's going to show you the moment to use them. And those may become some of the most most important words that were ever put on a page for your family and maybe a fourth generation that follows you. Write the story. Write the story. I guarantee you, if you get just a fancy looking little book, some journal book, and you start writing that kind of stuff, you put it on your coffee table, and every time your kiddos come in, they're going to be reading that. They're going to want it. And write one for each of your kids. They need your stories. They need the stories. And what about you parents? You're the middle generation. You're the middle of the three generations. And things may just not be so clear for you because you're kind of in the middle of the chaos, right? I mean, maybe you still have some incoming, blowing up all around you that comes from stuff that went on in the last generation. Or maybe that kind of went on in your generation when things were just wild and kind of crazy, where you'd make the best choices. And where you look around and you may see a lot of bad story that's going around you, That's because you're just on the other side of making a commitment to Jesus Christ. And maybe you're still trying to sort out a lot of stuff that impacts you. Things where you were hurt. Things where you were lost and couldn't find your way. And you've maybe left things in a mess for everybody around you. But I'm telling you, Jesus turns these things around. Jesus turns these things around because Jesus didn't just make a commitment to you. He has made a commitment to those who were before you, to the anchors in your family, because He was connected and working in their lives even before you even realized that. So have the courage to make some behavioral changes that have to have. Maybe you have to get past some past abuse. Maybe some anger that's just like poisoning you. Or to really straighten out your values. The values that just keep messing things up. And God can lead you. Look at the story of Jacob. The guy blows up his family and he runs away to escape, and then God just works on his life all the time and ultimately brings him back home. That means that Jesus is working to do that in your life. He's working to do that because He will bless you, He will lead you, He'll protect you, He'll provide you. And for you, your middle generation, you need to just move on that today. Just let Jesus kind of show you what that priority is and move on it today. Move on it today. Perhaps you just had a lot of failures and you're thinking to yourself, I think my story's just been snuffed out. Like I am been canceled by the editor, and my story's just not worth it. And I won't be able to reach it. My challenges and the things I went through just leaves me in a disqualified place. That's not true. I want to tell you that none of your lives are messed up as much as the lives of the people in the Bible. They were messed up bad. And it stretches across the history of the authorship of the whole Bible. I mean, it's just, and God never abandoned any of them. He loved them all. He worked on them, and he unfolded His plan of salvation among some of the most messed up people with bad stories, and nobody believed Him. And He chose them, and He used them, because nobody is disqualified in the heart of God. Nobody. Now, we need to get our teens into looking at this whole idea as well. Because, our teens, they're in this place. Hey, you guys are in that place, right now where you're going to be making a whole lot of decisions. And, you can make decisions that just take your life on a course that makes it really hard to come back from. A course where it just affects so many other people. And so I want you to think about those stories. I want you to go ask your parents and your grandparents and just tell me the stories about how God's been working in our lives. Because I want you to focus yourself on your values. Today in our world, it's just hard to figure out what our values ought to be, how we ought to live, what is the right thing to do. And Jesus always has the right thing to do. And if you will follow that, He will bless you. And if you don't follow that, He will be there and help you and course correct you, and He will bless you. And if you open yourself up to, if you just listen to that, because I want to tell you, the day is coming, guys, when you are going to be looking in the future, you're older, maybe you start having some gray hair, got kids running around all over the place and everything, and you look down on those generations that are in front of you, and you are going to realize that it's your job to pass down the values, your job to tell them the stories, to help them understand that God has a relationship with them. And to find and find people and surround yourself with people that have solid Christian values and faith in Jesus Christ. Pick a spouse who is a believer just like you. Devote yourself into following the life that Jesus has described for us in the Bible. Choose to live a life of integrity. Live a life where you're committed to living the right way that Jesus wants you to. And just chart that course ahead. Because your story is not just your story, but it's a story of your family. It's about generations. It's about the work that God has been doing in generations before you and is doing right now in your life that'll impact the generations ahead of you. And your story is also our story, the story of our church. And hey, I don't know if you recognize it, but it's the story of our nation too. And we need help there. And we as a people, as we stand in the midst of all the conflict and the chaos that's going on and the division that's around us, we need to stop and we need to realize who we are called to be. We need to realize that Jesus came into this world to set us free. And we need to realize that it is a noble thing to want to fight for your country to be free. Because in a free place, we can worship God. In a free nation, we can share freedoms where we can share our faith and where others can know about Jesus. Because the ultimate goal that Jesus came for, and He told him, He says, I've come to bring freedom, to set us free. And that's the way we ought to live our lives, from the inner life inside of us, in our families, in our church, and in our nation. And today is a great day to commit ourselves to that. I want you to tell your stories. I want you to tell the stories about how God's called you. I want you to tell the stories about how God has been faithful to you in the moments that He was just flat there and it made all the difference, where God had forgave you and helped you take rocks out of your backpack, how God didn't cancel you, God didn't blow you off, God didn't send you away, but He was always waiting for you to come home, and He was calling your name, that He's a God of grace that's calling you to live your life by faith. God is the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob. He is the God that stretches across generations. And that's why our generations need to be together. Because we build up our faith together. And your story matters. And your story is needed. Will you write your story? Write it down. Get your little notebook and just jot it down. I don't care if you spell the words right. I don't care if it's good English. You just slap those words on a page and just keep them around. They'll become treasures. Share your story. Share your story. Listen to the stories of those in the past. And as you're looking for guidance and direction in your life, people are going to need that story that you've shared. I guarantee you, if you have the stories, they'll be read. And when they come around and you have an audience, share the story. They'll listen. Because that's God's working through those stories. And God is working right now among each and every one of us through our church. Do you know that Spirit of Life right now, we're writing something new? Writing something new. What a wonderful thing to do, to think about our story on this Independence Day and this Freedom Day. Imagine the freedom of our lives, of our families, of our nation and our world if they heard and accepted the freedom of Jesus Christ. It would be the ultimate game changer. Let's work for it, okay? You can do it. Let's work for it.